Uh, in terms of you must love them. I mean, and to show the love of Christ is probably one of the greatest things that we can do when from an eldership perspective. Maybe something in common that brings them and draws you together. Uh, and then at times there may be times when an elder finds himself in a situation where he doesn't know the person well. We've had people who drop in at church and and you all have too. They drop in at church and they come in with a lot of needs and we really don't know much about who they are or what their backgrounds are, but yet we find ourselves in a situation to um, try to help them at some needs. And there are examples in scriptures where um, that happens, and the Samaritan woman would be one of those where they had nothing in common socially. You know, they were, you know, the Jewish people and the Samaritans were at odds with each other. They didn't like each other. There's a lot of disdain for one another there. Their context began with a very simple earthly request of the use of water, and it led into an interest that talked about God and eventually about uh, her need for salvation. But you know, Christ did a very unique thing there. He was very uh, he gave us a good example as to how to uh, witness to somebody that we've never witnessed to before. You know, he didn't come in prying and pushing and doing those kinds of things. He just came in and began to have an opportunity to relate to her about what the gospel was and what he had to offer. We also always should try to grow our groups. That would be to add people. And people do that from the people around them. You know, the best tool to grow church is to have people that find something at church that they want other people to know and experience, and then they come see, and we see that happened in Jesus's ministry. You know, Jesus went out, healed somebody. The next day, the group was larger because it was something people wanted. They wanted to see that. They were wanting to see the growth of that group because of that. If there's a relationship, it's even better, and they can build upon that relation. And if they're not a Christian, they at least need to know three things. They need to find out what does it take to become a Christian, and why becoming a Christian is important and the right thing to do, and what being a Christian has done for them. Normally, we pick people who come from common grounds, and then the idea of constantly building a relationship with those people once they're underneath the shepherding care. How do you manage the flock? I mean, it's a and how did Jesus do it? You think about Jesus's ministry. You know, he came obviously for the one major purpose of coming and being the final sacrifice that was needed to cover the sins of the world. Yes, he did that. But the other thing he did was he found those 12 men, even though one of them, Judas Iscariot, went the wrong direction and eventually betrayed him. But he took those men and trained them and taught them for 3 years. And in that training, he, you know, his goal there was he was training them to be the people that were going to lead the church after he went back to heaven. So it was very much a work that he was involved in daily in order to bring those 12 men up to the place that he wanted them to be. And the number, that 12 was probably the right balance of people that he needed. It's interesting to note that he did have an inner circle. You know, Peter, James, and John. John was the younger of the group, and probably very, very careful, very cautious type person. You know, Peter challenged leadership and was outspoken. And James, we don't hear much about, other than he was the first one martyred. But we have very little even spoken of by James in the New Testament. He taught them. That was his leadership style. He taught them by example, went out and did things and then showed them what needed to do. He worked with companionship between the group. He sent them out 2 by 2 and to try to get them to work together, knowing that they were going to have to work together whenever the church came into play. And we talked a little bit about, you know, that everybody doesn't have all those traits that came out of that are available, but those traits are there, and people were and each person has a unique set of traits and gifts and talents that they bring to the leadership group, and therefore are make a good balance of people. In other words, there's a, you know, I look at the leadership group that, you know, that I have, and that is there's a I look at my personalities. You know, there's some in that eldership group and on our staff that, you know, are very dynamic and outspoken. There's some that are gentle spoken. There's some that have compassion. There's some that are better teachers. There's some that are good preachers. There's some that are, you know, the balance of people are there, that we complement one another in that in terms of the group of leaders we have at church. And probably you can look around at your church and see that you have that same kind of, hopefully you can find that same kind of balances between your leadership staff and the elders or those leaders that you do have. And then the people are used to calling the elders to do things. We find in James, you know, the idea to call upon an elder if you're sick, and to have prayer, and to be and to be administered the oil, which would, you know, for first aid sake typically. And then just the idea of spiritual healing. You know, this is, and again, this is not a the idea that we do something miraculous. It's just that we are alert to the things that are biblically needed, and we look at people's lives and we say, you know, I need to be praying for that person because they're struggling spiritually, and to give them direction. And if we believe it's going to cause trouble within the church, then we need to get in front of it quickly and turn it so that it doesn't hurt the church, and hopefully helps them in their lives. It's not all about, it is about because they are part of the body. So let's talk about some of the roles of at least some elements of pastoral counseling, because I believe that a shepherd finds themselves and an elder finds themselves in that role quite often, that people are seeking them out for some kind of direction. And most of the time, this is not in a formal setting where someone comes in and they sit down and they ask for, you know, to be counseled. Normally, it's, you know, and it may be that you come into conversations where you find people are just, you know, they they tell you what's going on in their lives, and you end up in the middle of trying to help them with that situation. Yeah, we find this happens sometimes in the parking lot, or sometimes even if you run into them at the store. It doesn't necessarily, like I said, become a formal setting, but we do find ourselves, because of the role of having a leadership role at church, we do find ourselves in that role at times to have to do some counseling. Now, I'm not, I guess what I want to do here is separate them, that if I know my limitations and you need to know your limitations, and you need to understand that your people will have their limitations. If someone starts coming up with something that's like, drug addiction or alcoholism or depression, or, food disorders, or real deep seated marital issues. All right. I'm, there comes a point where my limitations are there, and I need to help direct them to more professionals who know what they're doing, and won't make a mess of it. So I do encourage you that a lot of times counseling in this situation is listening, just letting them talk, letting them talk, letting them talk. And you may at some point make some suggestions, but they're not there to fix it. You're there just to let them get it out of them, and let them talk about it, and not jump to conclusions about them. Sometimes, if they begin to confess sin, you obviously have to take the stance that sin is not acceptable in the eyes of God, but you have to find a way to balance that with trying to help the person and bring them back into the right relationship with Christ. So it's not, but the beauty of what we have is typically, and I'm not talking about deep-seated issues like alcoholism and depression and drug addictions and those kinds of things, but because those take a professional to deal with. And not that those professionals can't use the Bible, and I would encourage them to use the Bible if they are a Christian. But my point being is, probably one of the best resources we have is the Bible itself, to talk about it as a way to help people understand where God wants them to go, and to work through the issues that they're facing. Many of the issues I've talked about are people that are just hurting over the death of a loved one, or struggling financially, or struggling with within a family relationship, whether it's husband-wife issues, or whether it's a child that has gone astray, or whatever it may be. That those things are there, and they're part of that. And if we're in leadership and people see us, we're eventually going to be talked to about those things. So that kind of concludes part of this thing that talks about the shepherd. So let's now move over, and we're going to talk about the role of the elder when in that role of being a teacher. That, because I think when you look at that passage in Ephesians, that pastor teacher role is that role of being an elder that we're talking about here. And we've talked about the shepherd, the pastor side of it, the shepherding part of it. Now let's talk about the role of the teacher now. One of the roles of a teacher is to pass on biblical knowledge, because you can't. And the other side of it is you, the teacher, has to have that knowledge in order to teach. So you have to be willing to learn, and therefore you know, if you're going to be a Christian, you must be a disciple, you must be a learner. Uh, and one of those pieces that we'll talk eventually about, and some of those characteristics that Titus and Timothy bring out about what it takes to be an elder. We will talk about those a little later in this course. Um, is it you have to know what the biblical doctrine is. You can't, and you have to be able to discern. One of the things I challenge you to do is just go. If you have a favorite Bible preacher, teacher, uh, you know, like for example, I like the I like the smoothness and the way John MacArthur preaches, how he delivers his content. But when I go look at John MacArthur and his but when I go look at what John MacArthur's church believes, I mean, he's very solid in Calvinism. So I have to be very, very careful about what I listen to with him. And I'm not saying I listen to John MacArthur very often, but I just know that we have to be very cautious. We have to be able to discern what is biblical and what is not, and that's very much a piece that we have to be very conscious about in terms of what's being taught. And you know, it sure would be nice at times to be able to say, I've learned it all. I don't have to learn no more. But that's never true. I I hope I'm still learning things about God and his kingdom and his through his scriptures the day that I pass from this life on into the next. It's a very, the idea of needing to learn and to be a lifelong learner. Uh, as elders, we need to realize that if they're going to be an elder, that the Great Commission tells us we have to teach, to go and teach, that to preach and teach and do those things and to make disciples. That's an important part of that calling. And the other side of it is you can't be or remain a Christian if you are not a student and recruiting and or teaching. That Hebrews passage, and I don't know if it's in the text, but I have it here written out. It says, "For when by reasoning of time you ought to be teachers, you have need again that some." This is Hebrews 5:12. You need to again that someone teaches rudimentary through the first principles of the oracles of God, and are becoming such as you need of milk and not of solid food. So, the whole concept here is that we need to be teachers, and all need to be teachers. Even, this is just a call to leadership. This is a call to all Christians that they should be at some level teaching and bringing people to know Jesus. And it should be within a reasonable time. In other words, they can't spend lifetime after life, long, long periods of time. Um, and then we also find that in Matthew and Hebrews stresses obedience by Christians to teach. We've seen that. That's the Great Commission in the passage we just read in Hebrews 5. So Hang on a second. Joshua, if you can hear me, give me a thumbs up or say something, because it looks like you're on. Are you on now?
Hello, sir.
Okay, good.
Yes, sir.
Good evening.
Sorry.
Good to have you with us. All right.
Yes, I connected to our neighbor's Wi-Fi.
Okay, that works. Uh, we the other thing let's talk about a little bit too is I know you know, people look at those um, the list that we'll eventually talk about in Titus and Timothy as being a list of qualifications. And if we're honest with ourselves, for us to maintain that list of qualifications for a lifetime, or to find people that have been able to keep those qualifications for a lifetime, would be tough, be really tough, you know. So they're characteristics we're looking for. These are the things that we are looking for in that person, and hopefully we can find them to be faithful in those things regularly. Um, and I guess what I'm trying to stress here is it's not necessarily a checklist. It's not for us to walk down and say, okay, we're looking for an elder. So does this man work? Can we say he's this? Check. Can we say he's this? Check. Can we say this one? Check. All right. No, the idea is we're looking for people that embody that kind of a person. That's the kind of person we're looking for to be an elder. Uh, and Timothy in Timothy 3:2 describes one of those functions. One of those functions is to be able to teach. Uh, and I, you know, in some ways, I don't have my understanding of that Greek is that it's continuously teaching. It's not they just teach here or there, but they're constantly doing some teaching of some kind as they walk through that. And then in Titus Titus 1:9 says, kind of takes that teaching a little bit further, because it says holding fast the faithful word, which is in accordance with the teaching, so that he'll be able to exhort in sound doctrine and refute those who contradict it. So in other words, the teacher has a two-pronged role according to Titus. One is he teaches and exhorts in sound doctrine. He teaches the truth to people that are underneath his care. But on the other side too, he's able to find and refute the teachings that come that are false, that come about and are being taught. He must be a teacher. Um, you know, we look at Jesus being the model teacher. He is referred to as the master and rabbi in the church to his role of teacher. You know, I think I said earlier that someplace he says he's like 40 some times he's called that in the New Testament and the Gospels. And he taught in many different places. He's referred to in that role, but he taught in small groups with Nicodemus and Mary and the 12 and Lazarus. He taught in large groups, Sermon on the Mount, the feeding of the 5,000. All those were large group places. He taught in many different ways. He did discussions. He's talked in the way of storytelling. He questioned and answered. He gave object lessons. He gave examples. He used visuals. He did formal discourses. He did writing. And he taught in many different venues. He taught by the seaside, in homes in the desert, and from the boats, from in the synagogue, in a temple, and on a mountain. You know, basically wherever he was teaching. You know, he spent his 3 years in ministry teaching. That was his primary function in terms of the day-to-day things that he did. And when we look at the apostles, we find in Acts 2:42, the idea that, and they continued in the apostles' teaching, prayer, and so on. That verse that we're used to reading, they were teaching, and that was one of the starting points of the four pieces of the points of starting the church there in Acts. The apostles' teaching, the breaking of bread, the fellowship, and prayer. And all of these require the teaching the people have to do, and the same is true today. We still have the same things to do. We still have to teach what the Bible teaches. We still come together for the Lord's Supper. We still come together for fellowship, and we still come together for prayer. Those things have not changed. And the Bible is our best authority for when it comes to teaching. In some ways, it's our only authority for teaching. So now this thing talks about the idea that the Bible is not a good luck charm. We need to be familiar with it. It is an intelligent revelation of the God of creation, and it should be used intelligently. I guess my next section just deals with some things that we need to be, and this gets in a little bit into the theory of teaching, folks, is what this does, this next piece. But I think some of it's important to us to remember, and that is, we call it the 5 R's, all right? And I'm going to talk about it a little bit, and if you've got questions and I guess what I'm getting at, to some degree, I can't take you to a scripture and verse to find this material, okay, is what I'm getting at. But I think what you're going to see is that it was embedded in what Jesus did. It was embedded with what the apostles did, all right? And we'll give some examples of that, or try to, as we move through some of this. So let's, and maybe what we'll do is we'll use it in relevance maybe to the Samaritan woman, all right? We'll try to use it in terms of that. So for example, readiness means, are the students ready to learn? If they're not ready to learn, then it's not, they're not going to listen, all right? So so let's use the Samaritan woman in that case. If she hadn't come with a heart looking and knowing she needed something more, she wouldn't have taken it, or if there had been something in the way. So, and a lot of times we talk about it in our situation. If we have a student that comes to school hungry, they're probably not ready to learn. And that's so, and then relevance. Is the information something that being taught relevant? In other words, do they need that information right now? Is that something that's important to them right now? And that's part of the biggest problem with education in itself, is helping students understand that what's being taught is relevant, that they need that information. If it's not relevant, the listener won't be engaged. In other words, if you look at the Samaritan woman, if she had not seen that as Christ began to engage her about living water, she probably would not, she probably would not have, probably wouldn't have engaged Jesus in conversation, but she saw that there was relevance. There was something that she wanted in that living water, so there was relevance. Rigor means that there has to be a balance so that the learner is challenged. So let's just put it this way: if someone came back to you and said you're going to have to go to a math class, and they start with what is the answer to 1 + 1 or 2 + 2, well, that's not hitting you at a level where you need to be. You already have gone past those concepts in math. All right. And same thing with the Samaritan woman. If Jesus had come to her and started talking to her and giving her a lesson on the history of the Samaritans, she didn't need a lesson on the history of the Samaritans. She already knew that history. That was apparent because she said, our fathers have worshiped on this mountain for years. She didn't need that lesson any longer. And it needs to have something to, there needs to be an hour that's built upon information that's recent to them. And using that living water example made that very, very easy, very much to be true for her. She, the whole conversation was recent. I'm drawing water out of this well, and I'm also, Jesus was sitting there talking about living water. So it made it very, very much a relevant conversation to them. And then retention. There's got to be a way that the student holds on to that information, that it's retained. Because if they don't, as we have the saying, if it went in one ear and out the other, it didn't do any good. And I guess, but let's just put it this way. I think when it comes to retention, the Samaritan woman did a good job of retaining the information, because you think about what she did. She went into town and she told her husband and told the people in the town what she'd seen and what she'd heard. And this man knew who I was and knew about my history, and therefore knew who I was. So she retained the information. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about some of these things, just a little bit, and that is how do we help people retain information? Because I'm not, when I say what I'm about ready to say, I'm not being negative toward men, and I'm talking about men. I'm not talking about mankind. I'm talking about men, not women. Men have typically have an attention span of around 10 to 12 minutes before their mind's going to wander off and go someplace and then come back again, hopefully. All right. So what increases the ability for a male to have retention, right? And one of those things is that the retention is given in terms of the idea that they're able to talk about it and do something with it, with their hands, or do something with that information while they're talking about it. Means that they'll hold on to it longer, which means, and I'm not being critical of what you're doing, because this is true worldwide, and that is, which makes church not a very doesn't make church the most appealing place for men sometimes, because what happens is, men at times, do they like to sing? No, they're not going to sing. I was in another church this past Sunday, not my one where I'm I work and I had there was a guy just, we were socially distanced because of COVID, but I could hear him sing, and he had a phenomenal voice. He was sitting 6, 8 feet away from me, and I could hear he had a phenomenal voice. And I told him that as he was leaving. But men don't like to sing. Men don't typically want to be called on to speak or to pray or to do some of those things. Not the average man, all right? So we have to make sure that church is relevant and is a position where men can have retention of information given there. And understand that people learn. Now, I'm not talking about men any longer. This is all people. All people learn typically through the primary 3 senses, all right? Through the idea of what they see. So when we read something, is it something that we keep? In other words, and I'm going to ask you this in a minute, which way are you? All right? Do you learn better by seeing something? Do you learn something better by hearing something? Or do you do better learning by what we call tactile, or by touching it and handling it and using it and manipulating it? So, Joshua, what about you? I'm not going to ask all of you. What about you? What way do you best learn?
Actually, sir, most of the time, I like it better when I'm working with my hands.
When you're touching something.
Yeah,
okay?
yeah.
All right.
And that's the best way I learn things.
Okay.
And
So now, but I'm not. Please don't take this. I'm not calling you out, but I want you to think about something for a minute. Is church conducive to that? Do we touch things do we do things with hands at church typically? No, we typically don't, do we, Josh? We normally sit there and talk, all right? So if you learn by hearing, all right? If you learn by hearing, then church is a good environment for you, all right? How about somebody else? Somebody else want to volunteer in the group? Or am I going to have to call on somebody?
Richard will volunteer.
That's okay. What about you, Rochelle? What do you find best way you learn? Do you learn by visual or hearing, or by touching and doing something?
By hearing, sir. By hearing.
By
I
hearing.
learned it by hearing.
Okay.
By hearing. By hearing.
Okay. How about Teo? How about you? How do you learn best?
For me, it's by hearing and then reading.
And reading. Okay. So now he brings up a good point. Okay. So I want you to go back and rethink what we've just talked about. And that is, normally I normally combine 2 together. All right. You following me? I'm normally good as being a learner by hearing and by doing or touching. All right. The visual side is not my best. To sit there and read it typically doesn't help me a lot. But if I hear it and I go do it, I'm better. So you think about it a minute. So Joshua, I'll come back just to you only. What if you were going to add one to it, visual or reading, or visual or hearing, which one would you add to the touching and doing hands-on? Would you add one to those?
For me, sir, it's visual. I read and do.
Read, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
we.
But before, when I was still a student, I didn't like really the environment of the classroom. When I get in and sit, I want to get out right away.
So why is that? Why is that, Joshua? Why is that? Why is that true? Because don't get me wrong, you're not alone in that. Why is that?
Well, actually, sir, the reason I typically that's what I usually think it's because of the kind of people I'm with. When I was in college, I didn't really know the people, the students who are with me, because here, when you're in college, you have a you're placed in a section, and those are your classmates for the rest of the year. But for me, because I was a transferee, every time I go inside the classroom, I didn't know the people there. So that's why I want to get out right away.
But go ahead and take a look at it, but look at it from this perspective then, and that is, if but the classroom environment you were in didn't lend itself to interaction with one another enough for you to believe that you became part of it. Does that make sense?
The reason actually, sir, is different because it's because I'm thinking of other things. When I was in college, the first education that instead of going inside the classroom, I always think of football.
Wow.
So soccer.
Distracted in college is what you're telling me. Okay. All right.
Yeah. Instead of focusing at the academics, I think of the soccer field. I want to get out right away. That's the reason.
But you see, you got to understand that goes back to what we said a minute ago. It's got to be relevant to you, and it wasn't relevant to you at the time. Your mind was thinking about soccer and that, not about the material that was being presented.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, and in some ways, the professor, the professor should have found a way, if he knew, and I understand if he had 70 students in front of him, it's next to impossible. But he needed to find a way to make that content relevant to you, right? Is what he needed to do. That it's hard to make some things relevant at times, and I realize.
And during that time, the subjects wasn't really relevant for me.
Wasn't going to be relevant. Okay. So I guess the thing I'm trying to get across to you is, and I hope you do it whenever you whenever you plan your sermons and those things, man, and that is that you think about what you're going to say, and is it relevant to the people? Is it something that they're ready for? Are they? How are they going to retain it? Is it at the right? Is it recency enough? In other words, and recency just has to do with, in your mind, maybe at Christmas time you talked about all this deep stuff about the virgin birth and what happened and the wise men and all that. It's in your mind, but to come back and say to them, well, we talked about this at Christmas time, and here I'm going to carry on and talk a little more about it. You may have to go back and review the material for them to understand it. May be part of it. So don't, I guess what I'm getting at is always consider who the audience is and what's going to happen in terms of them I guess, so let me back up. Let me rephrase what I'm really trying to say is, folks, don't let your ego, I'm going to put it on bottom line. Don't let your ego or your desire to talk about a particular topic dictate what you teach or preach. You need to say, what does this group of people need? And are they, and if they're not ready for it at the level you want to take it to today, then you need to start working to build them to that point so that they're ready to accept that piece. I was guilty, and one of the things I was guilty of whenever I taught high school was there were certain topics when I talked about aviation, I really liked navigation. I really liked to talk about aircraft systems. I really didn't care a whole lot about talking about the weather, all right? But so what I did, and I was young at the time, I was in my 20s when I did this, I found myself I would spend a whole lot of time on these subjects that I really, really liked. And then I would turn around and find myself at the end of the year going, I'm not going to get all this covered, which means I shortchanged my students in that process to get them what they really, truly needed. So, so I guess I'm just saying is you need to find the right timing and right balance, and I mean, I'll give you some idea. We just hired a lead minister, and he'd been here about 6 weeks, and we went into a meeting, and he handed us all out a piece of paper and said, here's my teaching for the rest of the year. Here's where I believe this group of people needs to go for the rest of 2021, with the exception of 3 or 4 weeks here and there. He was ready. He knew where he wanted it to go. He was planning.
Actually, sir, one of the important things that I learned in the ministry, as young as I am in the ministry, is that if you don't know the people, if you don't have a personal relationship with the people, you're not really going to know what to to teach or preach them, because you won't know what they need.
I agree with you, Josh. I do agree with you that really the ministry is about relationships and having good relationship with people. Any other thoughts or comments today? I haven't heard anything from Dong today. Are you're just really, really quiet over there? Is there something going on, Dong? So now did Dong just? Oh, there he is. Okay.
Right.
I wondered if he'd come to class and then went back someplace and had dinner or something on me. I don't know, but.
I'm sorry to come late. I just had my birthday and
Okay.
came late.
All right, so let me bring you up to speed on what's going to happen next week. Next week, I'm going to be, this time next week, if all goes as planned, I'm going to be with Brother Wes in Florida. So we will not have class next week, all right? And I will put that out on BICM so that you all know it, okay, that it's there. I plan to leave on Wednesday and spend about 3 days trying to get down there and get back and spend some time with him. It's about a 1,200 kilometer trip, 1,200 miles, so kilometers. So we'll see. I'm hoping that I have a good visit with him, and just the materials he wants me to have that he has right now. So I encourage you to spend some time working on your papers, guys. I put that out there, and I encourage you to work on that paper right now. Okay?
Okay, sir.
And I'm hoping that when we come back together in class, if something's really important, I'll put it out there for you. But if not, 2 weeks from today, I'll give you a good update on where Wes is at. All right? So, but I'll try to put something up on BICM while I'm there or after I've left next week. We will not have class for this class next week. All right. Okay. So all you're going to see is I'll post the recording, but that's going to be it. Okay. That'll be it. Any other questions, guys? Dong, will you close us in prayer? I think you've got your mic unmuted, or you did. So why don't you close us in prayer, okay?
Okay, shall we pray? Dear Lord, we thank you for this night. Thank you, Lord, for the class, and we thank you, Lord, for learning to challenge us to improve in our teaching ministry. Father God, we thank you for the life of Father Wayne and his ministry, teaching ministry with the ICF. And we pray also, Lord, for his plan, his trip visiting with you, and give him safety. And Father God, just thank you for being with us, in our ministry and our family. Give you thanks now, everything, and trust you in Jesus' name. Amen.